And it was a bit of a rousing claim. Okay, it's 30 minutes. There we go. That I think we need to be engaging it humbly. You know, when you read 100 years of the field scholarship saying this new technology is going to revolutionize the field, you know, you start to understand that no, technological change itself is not going to truly revolutionize the entire field. That we need to be engaging with broader social movements for justice and equity if we're actually going to have change out there. And so it's just a reminder to me to be humble about like what I think the integration of video into first-year composition at my university is going to do for the field. You know, it's good. I mean, I'm happy about it, but I also understand and need to think about those limitations. And so it's a reminder to me to do that work. All right, that's it. I know there are also possibly respondents, or is that? So I'm not sure how you want me to kind of do the Q&A, or if there's people leading off, or.
Yeah, it's just Q&A.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Oh, and so earlier in your talk, I'm so fascinated by this. You mentioned that, you know, as English teachers, you know, we need to get out into the public and really kind of challenge like things about dialect and, you know, even with new media. But how can we as graduate students who are positioned as graduate students go out into communities, go out into the public and start to enact these changes? Do you have any suggestions for that?
You know, of course, this is complex, and I bet there are probably actually people in this room who have better answers than I do. You know, certainly I think engagement with things like the National Writing Project and sort of sites that are bringing together, you know, K-12 teachers and college educators is one place to start. I think trying to do scholarship that exists live on the web and attempting to get audiences, you know, beyond. But I think, and that was the point I was trying to make when I said, like, our scholarship hasn't changed as much as we might want it to, is that, yeah, it has changed. It's gone digital. We have a super long tradition of that at this point compared to that time period. But at the same time, we still, some of the conventions of print scholarship linger in how we do it, and what would it mean for us to start really imagining what would our scholarship need to look like for real people out there in the world to want to watch it voluntarily. And I think if we ask that question, first of all, you know, I think an easy way to start is, okay, maybe you actually do the web text that has part of the academic writing that people don't want to read section, but it also has one really great 2-minute web video. You know, that's part of that web text that helps get you jobs and get you tenure, but that also could circulate on Facebook and Twitter and other places. And I think that's an idea of where to start. And I think part of it, too, is just forms of activist research that I know people here are doing, collaborating with activist groups in communities on research, I think is obviously a direction to go, and actually not something I've been that great about in my own field, which is why I wanted to throw that out to you. And then I think finally for me, it's actually just taking the time when I meet random people who have very narrow ideas of my field, to actually be willing to educate that person next to you on a plane for a second. Like, you know, I don't know if that always works, but it's sort of telling me, like, you know, I think like on a micro level, if each one of us just had a conversation about language diversity with that inevitable person that says, oh, you're an English teacher, I gotta better watch my grammar around you. Maybe that makes a difference. I think we need to think about, you know, we need to think about what Cindy Self calls small potent gestures too, and not just big grandiose stuff. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation, first off. I was very interested in one of your points at the end, talking about more vernacular multimodal composing and kind of really expanding those non-traditional scholarly genres. I was wondering if you could give a few more examples of what you would imagine that looking like. I've done some things with like comics is kind of what I'm working on, and so that's what I'm interested in. But I was just wondering what other genres did you have in mind as you were saying that?
First of all, I think comics is actually a really great genre that I think could reach a lot of people. So I'm really excited that you're working on it. And you know, I personally just haven't been able to wrap my head around comics as a multimodal composer, so I'm not doing that work. But I think that's a great area. I mean, I was especially thinking in terms of vernacular video, but that's because that's sort of a personal interest for me as a composer and scholar. You know, I think the right kind of Twitter feed could do this sort of work. I think, what else would people throw out there as if you were thinking, I'm kind of curious, Like, what would be the technologies we ought to be using? Yeah.
There's also, I know, possibly trying to do some blog work, like with what Samantha Blackman does for Not Your Mama's Gamer.
Yes, I am a huge, and the podcast work, she's really reached, people should check that out if you have not. She's really gotten people in the gaming community downloading those podcasts, beyond our academic. And part of the reason is because, that podcast actually sounds like a podcast. And not as much like a traditional academic article. It has that real sense of conversation to it, and and I think that's a great example. So I'm glad you brought that one out there. I don't think it's really based on the technology per se as much as sort of what tools are you comfortable with, and then what's already out there. It's sort of taking our inspiration not just from what we are doing with media in the field, but what's going on out there in communities, and that's always going to change.
And also, Aaron, you and I need to talk.
Yes.
I'm also way into comics.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the method.
Okay, yeah.
I find it very compelling and transportable to public audiences, especially in our current crisis mode of distraction and the inevitable way in which all children are doomed and that sort of thing. But so I'm wondering if you would mind sharing more about how you and Ben came to that method, and also just if you could share how you can just collaborate with each other.
Well, yeah, I'll start on method, and I can kind of get to collaboration. Thank you so much for that question. And I also would appreciate feedback on method, because the turn to data visualization quantification, if you would have told me even 5 years ago that I would be doing work in that, I would have been like, girl, no. I do not do things with numbers. But what I found is I started seeing interesting work out there, and I said, well, I never could figure out what to do with 360 articles in the English Journal. And this could be a great way to get a handle on it. I will say I was inspired also by a piece that I can send you, Dressman, and I can't remember the other name, that was actually done on poetry in English Journal over quite a few years that used a similar methodology that was in a longer version of this talk. Derek Mueller's work has been a strong inspiration to us just in seeing the potential and looking up that work. But really, the way it worked for us was a very iterative process. I'd already come across this stuff in English Journal. In one version of my book, it was going to be in there, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I already knew there was cool things there. And I knew a little bit about what kind of cool things might be there. So I had some idea of what would be interesting questions for us to ask. And Ben was also interested in history and interested in data visualization particularly, and so we were natural collaborators. But our process really was very much an iterative one, where we came up with a coding scheme, then sat together for a couple days at Ben's house in Columbus and just tried to use it. And then saw where it wasn't fitting, saw where it didn't, and kind of went back. And then kept in contact with each other over time. If I think about it, and I realized I'm live on the web, I can actually show you our spreadsheet, most likely. You're just sort of interested in what we did here. So we used this Google form to create a spreadsheet, so that way we didn't have to look at a spreadsheet, because that was much too scary for me to look at. Now I can't seem to scroll in this browser. There we go. So we had a controlled vocabulary for things like the form of media that we kept adding to over time as we discovered stuff that we didn't know was there. So we were able to keep editing it. And then we had controlled vocabularies for things like production versus reception, for kinds of technological use, outcomes, arguments about new media. The arguments about new media has proven to be the hardest one to pin down into a codification scheme. I think that's going to remain inherently limited. And one of the things I'll say about the methodology is I don't think distant reading is a replacement for close reading. I'm thinking in the larger book project this might turn into. Ultimately, what I want to do is use distant reading as a way to find those moments, and then dig into that moment when radio production took hold and read the discourse ecology around it and read some text much more closely. So for me, it's about actually a way to ask new questions. It's not really answering questions per se. Even then it can show us, for example, that production seems to take hold when media are new. but it can't really explain why. It says, that's an interesting thing that maybe we haven't thought before. Now let's go in and look forward from that. I don't know if that answered the question, or anyone else who has any thoughts on the question of method. I certainly would love advice there too from anyone who might be doing work like this. Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you think about those historical moments that you might want to do more exploration and understand the ecology of it, are there other sources that you might look at that you've contemplated?
Yeah, this is something I've thought a lot about. There are interesting textbooks that went on, like even in this talk, ultimately like saying, okay, well I found that article about the use of instructional tapes in order to reinforce reactionary notions of language. I was like, well, it was really helpful. I had a suspicion as to what was producing this text and to what it would look like, but when I actually got a hold of the record and read the liner notes and listened to the record, I had a much deeper understanding. So in some cases it's that. NCTE reports too. There were numerous reports done at different time periods about like radio, about television, about film. I think that's things we're going to have to start gathering. Media history too, is that I realize in many ways this is actually a history of media in the 20th century, and not just a history of English studies. And so what we're increasingly having to do is actually finding out what was going on with radio in the whole culture at this time period, and especially issues of access, which I think have emerged. It's something that people were talking about over and over in these time periods too, and to really understand what's going on with access, we kind of need a deeper media history. So yeah, I think in some ways the data viz for me is really going for possible case studies to come. But I think the case studies are more interesting when they're placed in a deeper context that I think the visualization hopefully can do. So, yeah.
I think one of the challenges that we face is that when we sit here as an intellectual community, we're fairly much on the same page.
Right.
And we can talk within the context of, say, a graduate seminar or, a conference about the integration of multimodality into the writing curriculum. And then what happens is that we go teach on Monday morning, and depending on where we do that, and the cultural ecology for what writing is, or that limits, that enables and constrains what writing is or it can be, I know that there can be a lot of frustration. As a writing program administrator, how do you grapple with those issues? What sorts of resistance do you encounter, and what sort of advice would you give both graduate students and faculty, including future faculty, about the ways that they can enact that type of small, potent gesture as faculty in English departments? Because some English departments, I think, are moving forward, but even as I say that, I think that can often be the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah.
It's a tough question.
That's a great question. I'm glad that you're giving me a chance to talk about that. So to sort of localize it in terms of my campus is one thing that we've done is that we've integrated engagement with digital and multimodal forms of composing into our first year composition course. And as part of our outcomes and as part of the assignment sequence where students revisit one of their earlier essays and transform it into a different kind of media. And one of the challenges that we've had is we have a very diverse teaching staff of graduate students and adjunct faculty and full-time faculty, and we have multiple campuses as well. We have the Oxford campus that has a, not exclusively, but largely class-privileged student body, and also the ability for all composition classes to be taught in technological environments where students have access to computers. We also have 2 regional campuses that teach a much more diverse student body, a student body that is not as class privileged, and that do not have the same level. They have some computer labs, but not every person is going to be in a computer lab. And trying to negotiate across campuses what this looks like. First of all, it's not perfect, and it's problematic in so many ways. And I just need to acknowledge that at the beginning. But I think the thing that's been transformative, and I've spent a lot of time doing workshops and conversations on all of our campuses, is we really exploded what counts as the technological and the multimodal. And some of the people on regional campuses actually have now brought that methodology and inspired many of us to rethink this. This is not go make a video, but this is transform an argument into a different form of media, which might be live performance, which might not be digital at all. And that's actually been really good for us. So I think on Oxford campus, really expanding our notions of what the multimodal counts about. And so I think in some ways, first of all, just having an expansive discussion about what multimodality means and thinking about it in terms of context and not privileging the newest and latest technologies as the only or even the best way to go about doing things, I think is just a really important political move. It's also a good move for students and teachers that have different levels of comfort with different kinds of composing, but also different things to bring, too. We're trying to work a lot on issues of language diversity as well in our curriculum, and one of our first assignments has students reflecting on themselves as users of language and as users of rhetoric, and as we've transformed our common reading resources and also our publication of student writing each year, our piece that won one of our awards published in the front of our book this year is all about language diversity, written by an African-American woman in one of our classes, and I think that's been important. And I was pleased that it doesn't always work well, let me tell you. There's difficult conversations, but at least I think part of it is at least attempting to, when we are talking about rhetoric, when we are talking about multimodality, we are also talking about language diversity at the same time, or at least attempting to. But it certainly is, it's difficult, and it's small potent gestures, and sometimes it's even just sitting down with a faculty member in another discipline and helping them move from I fail things when they have 5 errors to it might be possible for you to engage the student's ideas. So, I want to note, having been radical, that sometimes the radical I'm going to get in your face approach is the one you need, and admittedly sometimes I do default to a more conciliatory approach. Although I guess what I would also say is I think the field needs both. I think we really do need people that are calling out these issues in really radical ways, and people that, are going to take the time to patiently deal with that faculty member who fails people after 5 errors. Because we get them to stop doing that, we've done something. And yeah, I'm increasingly thinking about how can we systematize. We haven't really systematized language diversity as a critical understanding of language diversity strongly into our outcomes, and started assessing for that. And I think that's like the next step. That was transformative on moving towards the multimodal, and I think we really need to think about that too. Yeah.
I was pleased to see your call to action and awareness that if we're changing something at this level, we need to also be talking to secondary educators. As someone who's I've taught from kindergarten to college, and I teach college now, and it's very difficult to go back and say, and I've sat in a few classes where they're in-service students in graduate school, they're 8th grade teachers or high school teachers, and I'm talking about the things I do in my classroom, and they're like, how do I do that for 120 students? So this is your call to action. How would you tell that student, that in-service teacher at the secondary level, what would you tell them? How do you connect with them? Where do you see that working? How do you, you mentioned the National Writing Project, but what other things would you do for them?
Yeah, first of all, I'm glad that you brought out also that sort of question of material conditions, and I think that's in some ways my call for humbleness and for collaborating with social movements, is to sort of understand that there will be limitations to what can be done, and some of that has to do with the sort of material social structure that produces teachers who have to teach under 20 students. But that said, I think a lot of it for me is beginning with conversation, not I'm going to tell you how you can bring what I do in my college classroom to your class. I'm going to ask you, what do you want your students to learn? What are your goals? Get you to start talking about that, and then start proposing different possible ways that can happen on a small level of change. So, for example, if doing a whole multimodal composing assignment seems like too much, let's talk about ways to welcome multimodal strategies of invention, or to do work like that. I think, I think part of that dialogue with teachers really has to come from a position of just understanding where they're coming from and trying to ask more questions than give more answers. And I think realizing that whatever pedagogy they're going to design has to be local, and they're the people that really understand what that is, but you can hopefully provide kinds of support and just questions to ask them that maybe they hadn't considered. And I'd say that's usually my strategy when I'm doing things like that.
Yeah, and kind of to add on to the question that she asked there, I was also kind of wondering, because I've actually had the opportunity to talk to several high school English teachers, but a lot of their main concerns at this point in time is that they don't really have that kind of flexibility to even do anything, because they have to do a lot of teaching to the tests of this stuff that their seniors have to take in order to pass. There's a lot of, right now, like teaching to the test type of stuff, and I was wondering, how do we deal with that if we're in the dialogue, but they kind of have this immovable wall of something that they just can't bend on?
So yeah, I mean, teaching to the test, I mean, first of all, it is part of the reason why I think it's in the humbleness, like the call for there are kinds of social action we need to engage in beyond that produce this kind of narrow version of testing. But yeah, when you're in the system, you have to deal with that while you're at it. And I think it comes down to, and that's also a really good reason why, for example, alphabetic reading and writing is the primary reason how people thought media should be used in English. This is part of the way that happens, is you have to go back to, okay, well, what are your ultimate goals? What are your outcomes as a teacher? Those may be narrowly defined by testing. But, student engagement is also something you're going to need if you're going to get people to succeed on that test. So can we find a way to mediate between these two so that you're engaging with multimodality, but bringing it back to, whatever that core concern is? And I think I saw you had things to say on this issue or another, so I wanted to make sure I stopped talking and went over to you.
Thank you. I would like to shift the focus a little bit from what we as teachers do and what we think. I wondered if in your research you found any materials that talked about that engage the students' perceptions from the students' view. How are they coming at multimodality? How are they perceiving their roles? And what might that do for how we talk about multimodality and risk-taking and expanding the field?
I like that question a lot. And, one thing I would say is that the Archive of English Journal is pretty much exclusively an archive of teachers writing about students rather than students writing for themselves. So, but at least what I found in my 50 years of reading a lot of it, and I guess that's also a call for us to, and there is important work going on in the field bringing in undergraduates into scholarship, and it's a reminder of, why we need that. I will say, when students are talked about in English Journal, one variety is the kids have been more engaged by media than reading since at least the 30s. And really, no, actually, even 1916, some of the first stuff on film, they're like, they all like these silent movies. They don't want to read books. So I'd say that's true. Like that, and maybe you could convince them to read a book if you showed them a really great silent movie in the book, and then they'd want to read it. Like, this trope is really, that's one of those things. So whenever someone tells you, like, these kids today with their Facebook and their Twitter, they're not reading, it turns out that, but maybe if we had them tweet about the book, they would read it. Turns out that argument has a history. So that was one thing that I picked up. That's a trope about students, that they constantly are bored by alphabetic literacy as it's taught in English, but excited about whatever the new media was of that decade. And so that trope I heard a lot. And that's partly what led to the second act of my talk. More deeply problematic is, the ways that students are talked about, and the sort of students that are imagined as not engaged by alphabetic literacy are often students of color and immigrants, or students that are positioned as in some ways disabled. And it's a scary history of the field to really read a lot of it. But I think it's a history that is important for us to remember and not look away from, because even though a lot of change has happened, a lot of important change has happened in the field, these kinds of social discourses still exist out there through the educational system. And so I guess, but yeah, I really wish I had more great student voices from it, but it's really interesting that now, and that's something actually, and I should note, like, I was being a bit hyperbolic when I said, like, our scholarship ain't changed. Of course it has, and we see more student work in our online journals all the time, and that's for the good, and I'm